words on the screen, I hope. None of us have this back here.
Yeah, they're on the screen. I guess that bird's turning around. Good evening. Good seeing y'all out today and this afternoon. And I kind of got the backup singers with me. I kind of feel like Clint Eastwood, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'm not going to single anybody out. Okay, let's trust and obey. Stand, please. Huh? Excuse me?
When we all get to heaven.
Oh, when we all get to heaven? You want to do that one first? Okay. When we all get to heaven. Now, don't cut my pay. Sing the wondrous love of Jesus. Sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, will prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we stand, be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of Him in glory, live the tools of life away. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Onward to the prize before us, soon His beauty will behold. Soon the pearly gates will open, we shall tread the streets of gold. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Okay, that second verse is not in the hymn book. I don't know where they came up with it. Okay, now let's do trust and obey. Okay. When we walk with the Lord in the light of His word, what glory He sheds on our way. What a thrill His good thrill He abides with us still, and with all is fairer than day. Okay. There's a land that is fairer than day, and by faith we can see it afar. For the Father reigns over the way to prepare us a dwelling place there. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. We shall sing on that beautiful shore the melodious songs of the blessed, and our spirit shall sorrow no more. Not a sign for the blessing of rest. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. To our bountiful Father above, we will offer our tribute of praise for the glorious gift of His love and the blessings that follow our days. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. Living below in this whole sinful world, hardly a comfort can afford. Striving alone to face temptation's shore, where could I go but to the Lord? Tell me, where could I go? Oh, where could I go? Seeking a refuge for my soul, needing a friend to help me in the end. Where could I go but to the Lord? Neighbors are kind, I love them everyone. We get along in sweet accord. But when my soul needs manna from above, where could I go but to the Lord? Tell me, where could I go? Oh, where could I go? Seeking a refuge for my soul,
Him all about our troubles. He will hear our faintest cry, and He will answer by and by. When you feel a little prayer will turning, and you know a little fire is burning, you will find a little talk with Jesus makes it right.
Thank you, gentlemen. You can draw a straight line from Matthew chapter 23 to the cross. Because when Jesus got through with Matthew chapter 23, there was no doubt the powers that be in Judaism were going to get rid of Jesus. As the chapter begins, Jesus is talking to the crowds and to the disciples. But pretty soon he turns the message to the Pharisees. And 8 times he says, "Woe to you Pharisees." And surely their resolve was now absolutely set. We've got to get rid of him. And they did. At least they thought they did. And I want to focus on 2 of those, well, really one of those woes that he said to them, because I think they all apply to us. They all apply to people who consider themselves to be religious. They all apply to people who consider themselves to be good. And the Pharisees were religious, and the Pharisees, by most standards, were good. They set out to preserve the law. They set out, as they said themselves, to build a hedge around the law to protect it. They set out to serve God. They set out to be examples, but they were so focused on the wrong things that they missed Jesus. And it was near the end of the sermon when he finally put the nail, if you will, in the coffin and revealed that the hope for Jesus was gone. Matthew chapter 23, verses 27 and 28. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and uncleanliness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you!" When the spring rains ceased in Palestine, Jews in the New Testament times began the practice of whitewashing their houses and the walls around their houses, and particularly the tombs. They began the task on the calendar at about 15th of March. Part of this was to make their communities more attractive to the Passover of pilgrims who would be coming. But there was an additional reason for whitewashing grave sites. Because they were not graves in the ground, they were tombs. They were, not, for the most part, not natural caves. They had been dug back into the rock, and they were sealed up, and they were under the strict admonition. By the way, the Pharisees were the enforcers of this tradition, that you could not come into contact with the tomb or the dead body that was inside the tomb, or you would be ceremonially unclean. So they wanted to mark them very clearly. Don't go near the fresh, whitewashed tombs. You will be unclean and cannot celebrate Passover. And if they did come in contact, they were unclean for 7 days. They could miss the whole event. They could not come near the grave. They could not touch the body. And they could not offer sacrifices or participate in the activities of Passover. Sometimes the entire tomb was painted. Other times, just drawings of bones were placed on the tomb to mark it. And because of all the whitewash, Jerusalem glistened in the sun during the Passover season. Like whitewashed tombs, Pharisees appeared fine, but inside, not so much. This was not about cleaning up. It was not about minor changes. Jesus said, these people are spiritually dead. It doesn't matter how good it looks. Some years ago, we were on a mission trip in Ohio. It was known as the town where Mr. Wagnall of Funk and Wagnall's dictionary was from. It was a small town, tiny town. It almost makes Bluntville look big. It had a tiny little downtown and a few stores on both sides of the street. But the one thing it had, in the cemetery where he was buried, there was a massive tomb. And I'm not exaggerating. When you were on this trip, John, were you on that trip? It stood probably more than 2 stories. It was a massive thing. And the other thing that was large in that town was he left them a library. A rather large library. Big tomb, large library, tiny town. And the tomb looks wonderful. But inside the tomb are the remains of death. And no matter how good the tomb looks, the remains of death are in the tomb. Perhaps you've never heard of Mrs. Martin Van Buchel. Anybody ever heard of her? You have seen the work that she inspired. Well, you may never have heard of her because she's been dead for well over 200 years. And she left a will. It specified that on her death, her husband had control of her fortune as long as her body remained above ground. Now you see, you don't see where this is going, but you're going to in a moment. At the time she died, mausoleums were unheard of. So her husband hired a Scottish person who was an expert in anatomy to embalm his dead wife. Then he dressed her, began to sound like an old movie, in fashionable attire and put her on display in the parlor. What's that movie where the guy had his mother upstairs in the rocking chair? You know what I'm talking about? Daily, people were invited to come and visit and view the corpse inside a glass-lidded coffin. As news of how lifelike Miss Van Buchel looked spread, the practice of embalming became more thought of and used. Some embalmers, to drum up business, took their prize corpses on tour, exhibiting embalmed bodies in the windows of barber shops, in public halls, and at country fairs, so that rural folk could get a glimpse of the latest funeral treatment. And the public was impressed. I have a vision for myself in the parlor, embalmed, propped up, dressed. I don't think it's going to happen. And the fact remains that no matter how good Miss Van Buchel looked, she was dead. Perhaps you know of the story of Abraham Lincoln. On April the 21st, 1865, his body was placed on a train, and the train traveled 1,654 miles on a train full of cars with 300 people on the cars, including his little son who had died a couple of years earlier. And the train is now headed to Springfield, Illinois, for final entombment. And it stopped in many, many cities. And every time the train stopped, the body of Abraham Lincoln was taken off, put on a large horse-drawn carriage, paraded through the streets, and the coffin was opened and the body was viewed by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. Now, to make this happen, traveling in relatively warm weather on a train that is constantly moving and being moved around on horse-drawn carriage, they had a number of, thanks to Miss Van Buchel, a number of embalmers on the train, and they kept working on Abraham Lincoln. And they took many, many pictures. There's all kinds of pictures of Abraham Lincoln on that journey. And finally they arrived, but the tomb was not finished, so he and Tad were placed in a temporary tomb until the larger monument that you see now was finally completed, and he was finally put in there. And even then, that wasn't enough, because later on people tried to break into the tomb. And finally, the tomb was sealed, not the part you see, but the part where the body is was sealed in concrete. But no matter how good the embalmers were, or how much pomp and circumstance was given to that journey, Abraham Lincoln was still dead. And no matter how well these Pharisees, well-intentioned, intelligent, faithful, trying to serve people were, Jesus said their religion, their faith was dead. Now, what are the factors that could be common to us that could lead to spiritual death that we learned from the Pharisees? Number one, when tradition becomes more important than relationship, we're probably on the edge of spiritual death. And they were all about tradition. They wanted to preserve all the traditions. They wanted to do everything just like it had been done. You say, well, we are not like that, but we are. We like to have the traditions, as Jane was so fond of saying in A Spirit of Christmas. I did not write that line. She created it. But I did inspire it, I think. Tradition is not more important than a relationship with Jesus Christ. When religion becomes more important than the mission, when religion becomes more important than the mission, then we lose sight of what God has called us to do. And we can do the same thing. And they had lost sight of. They had lost sight of what God had called them to do. When self becomes more important than God, and what they were more important than the Word of God that they proclaimed to preserve. When appearance becomes more important than reality, and they did everything exactly right. The Pharisees would go out into the street and they would send out advance parties, and the advance parties would gather a crowd on a corner and they say, Rabbi is coming. And Rabbi is going to do a great work of charity. He's going to give out some offerings. Everybody gather around. Rabbi is going to give an offering. And Rabbi would step up and he would have some money available for the crowd. Oh, thank you, Rabbi, for what you've done. It was all about appearances. Jesus said, woe to you. He said it 8 times. Woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. Scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, actors. We don't think of acting as placing a mask in front of your face, but Greek drama did. And the mask depicted the character, not becoming the person or makeup or costume. The mask was the character, but behind the mask, there was the real person. He said, woe to you, Pharisees. You're hypocrites. What you appear to be is not who you are on the inside, but what you are is a tomb, whitewashed, looks great, but still death inside. You appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness because you got your emphasis on the wrong place and the wrong things. What does all this mean to us, and how can we make it right? Perhaps you saw the movie Dances with Wolves. I will never forget going to that movie because I had no idea how long it was. And I kept trying to figure out when this thing was going to end. There's a scene where Kevin Costner, Lieutenant Dunbar, awakens because he hears the sound of the thunder of buffaloes. He has come to know the Sioux Indians since he lives near their reservation. He learns that they're starving to death. He jumps on his horse and rides to the Sioux village. However, he does not know the Sioux word for buffalo. He has good news. The buffalo are here, but he can't tell them because he doesn't know the word. And finally, one of the braves cries out, Tatanka. And one word changes everything. It changed a starving people to people who had discovered their dietary salvation, their clothing salvation, the material they use for their teepee salvation, buffalo. What changes whitewashed tombs to life is Jesus. I would remind you that a few weeks ago we celebrated an event called Easter. And the whole focus of Easter is the fact that they did not need to whitewash Jesus' tomb. They didn't even get through preparing the body. They came back to finish that. He's already gone. Sabbath has passed. Jesus is out of the tomb. They're excited, they're intrigued, they're scared to death, they don't know what to do, they don't know what's going to happen to them. But the fact is that the Jesus they knew, the relationship they had, was going on because He wasn't dead. And what He offered them and what He demonstrated to them was not, we're going to seal up a body in a tomb and we're going to keep it as long as we can and we're going to parade the body around. The body did not exist in that way because the body was not dead anymore. And Jesus said, oh, by the way, this is what relationship with me is about. Not preserving the tomb, but preserving the relationship. Jesus came to set us free. Free from tradition. He wanted His disciples not to be mired in tradition, but related to the living God. Charles Spurgeon, tremendous pastor, preacher in London, was walking the streets of London, deep in thought, and he saw a young boy on the street, and the lad was carrying an old, worn-out, beat-up, bent bird cage. And inside the bird cage was a tiny sparrow. Spurgeon stopped the boy and asked him what he was going to do with the bird. And he said, well, I think I'll play with it for a while, and then when I'm tired of playing with it, I'm going to kill it. He made that last comment with a bit of a grin that moved Spurgeon to compassion for the bird. And Spurgeon said, how much would you sell me the bird for? You don't want this bird, mister. It's just a bleating field sparrow. But then he saw the old gentleman was serious. And he said to him, you can have the bird for 2 pounds. 2 pounds in our modern economy would have been more than $100. It's said that Spurgeon opened his wallet and gave him the 2 pounds. An astronomical price for a bird worth nothing or pennies. Spurgeon paid the price and let the bird go. Jesus paid a price for us to have an existence that's more than a whitewashed tomb, more than a life that appears to be successful, more than a whitewashed tomb. How we appear is not as important as who we are. And Jesus said, I want you to be my follower. I want you to live for me. And when you can't live here anymore, I don't want you to memorialize your life and have a cult that's built on this earth. I want you to look forward to me. I want you to know there's going to come a day when all the tombs, no matter how great they were or how well preserved they thought they were, the Egyptians thought they had done a great thing in preserving a few pharaohs in tombs. But the truth of the matter was, all but one of the great tombs that had been discovered were raided in antiquity far before they ever got to modern times, except one. And what happened to the one? In 1922, Howard Carter found King Tut's tomb. And King Tut's artifacts went all over the world. They're not there anymore. Some of them went to a little castle in England and were stored in a hidden chamber because Lord Carnarvon, you may have heard of Highclere Castle. It was also known as Downton Abbey. And not that many years ago at Highclere Castle, they discovered the walls between these two rooms were thicker than they could imagine, and they found out inside the wall was some of Pharaoh's treasures from the tomb that Lord Carnarvon had brought back from Egypt. Oh, King Tut, they intended for him to be in eternity with all his treasures. And in fact, his treasures were scattered to the world. Jesus said, that's not, you don't have to memorialize my tomb. You don't have to whitewash my tomb or yours, because I intend for you to be with me. I had a resurrected body. I intended for you to have a resurrected body. I overcame. I intend to provide you the way to overcome. What's the lesson for us? Would Jesus ever say to us, woe to you? Woe to you, religious folk. You're like whitewashed tombs. Outside you appear beautiful, but inside, full of dead men's bones. You can go to YouTube and you can look up well-known people. They're not well-known to us, but they were well-known in their day. They were kings and princes. And find out pictures that were taken when they opened their tombs. Kings, crown on their head. The only thing identifiable is the crown on their head. That's all that's left. Jesus said, I have come that you might have life, not life buried that lives here a while and is buried, life that is risen and resurrected. God, I pray that we learn valuable lesson, that everything we touch and everything we experience is temporary, and everything that comes from you is eternal. Let us do the best in every way that we possibly can to be like you, to represent you, to have a relationship with you, and let go of all the things that really don't matter. And we find joy, deep joy and peace from walking with you. We ask for your blessing. We seek your presence. Let us be real for you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for sharing with us this evening. John, thank you for leading us today. We have a song to end with today. Come and give it to us.
Lord, I'm coming home. Please stay.